The brakes did not respond. Elena Voss felt the pedals sink to the floor of the car, with no resistance at all, and for one long second her mind refused to accept what her foot already knew. The black sedan was moving down a steep service road behind the Voss Global building, gathering speed on a curve that dropped toward a concrete barrier and, beyond it, a 40-foot drop to the loading docks below. In the driver's seat, Jack Merrow did not shout. He did not waste a single word on panic. His hands moved before his brain finished the sentence forming in his head, pulling the wheel hard into a controlled skid, dragging the emergency brake in one clean motion while shifting the transmission down through the gears to fight the speed with friction instead of failed brake pads. The tires screamed against the asphalt. Elena's knuckles turned white around the door handle. The barrier came closer, closer, and then the car spun sideways and slammed to a stop with its rear bumper less than 2 feet from the concrete edge. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The engine ticked as it cooled. Somewhere above them, a pigeon startled off the roof and flew away. "Are you hurt?" Jack asked, turning in his seat, his voice steady in a way that did not match the situation at all. Elena shook her head, though her hands were trembling in her lap. She was 36 years old, the chief executive of one of the largest logistics companies in the country, and she had just come within 2 seconds of dying in a car with a man she had hired 11 days earlier because his resume had a line about a daughter with no mother listed beside it. "How did you do that?" she asked. "Nobody drives like that. Nobody thinks like that in half a second." Jack Merrow looked at the concrete barrier through the windshield, then back at the wheel in his hands. "I got lucky," he said. The road helped. It was not the truth, and something in his voice told her it was not the truth, but she let it go for the moment, because her legs had gone weak, and her heart was still hammering, and she needed to breathe before she needed to understand. 11 days earlier, none of this had seemed possible. Elena had built Voss Global from a single warehouse her father left her into a company that moved freight across 4 continents, and she had done it by trusting almost no one completely and testing everyone at least once. Her previous driver had sold details of her calendar to a gossip website for $8,000, and the one before that had tried to photograph documents left on the back seat. She was tired of hiring people who saw her as an opportunity instead of an employer. Her assistant, a sharp and patient woman named Priya Malhotra, had handed her a stack of resumes that morning with a warning that most of them were unqualified. Elena had gone through them quickly, the way she went through most things, until she reached one near the bottom of the pile. Jack Merrow, 34 years old, no college degree, a gap of 6 years in his work history with no explanation. Under emergency contact, instead of a wife or a parent, he had written the name of a 7-year-old girl, his daughter. Elena had asked Priya to bring him in that same afternoon, against her assistant's advice, and she still could not fully explain why. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the plainness of his answers in the short phone screening, the complete absence of flattery, the way he had not once tried to impress her. When he walked into her office for the interview, he wore a jacket that did not quite fit him anymore, the kind of ill fit that comes from losing weight you did not intend to lose. He answered every question directly. He did not ask about salary until she brought it up herself. "Why do you want this job?" she had asked, watching his face carefully. "Because my daughter needs a place to live that isn't the back seat of my car," he had said, and then, as if embarrassed by his own honesty, he had added, "and because I can drive, and I follow instructions, and I don't talk about my employer to anyone." She had hired him on the spot. Her head of security, a broad-shouldered man named Grant Okafor, had objected, saying they knew nothing about the 6-year gap in his file. Elena had overruled him. She told herself it was because she needed a driver by Monday. The truth, which she did not admit even to herself, was that something about Jack Merrow's stillness made her feel safer than any of the men with clean resumes and firm handshakes ever had. For the first 10 days, he was almost invisible. He arrived before she asked, opened doors before she reached them, and said very little beyond what the job required. He did not comment on her phone calls, even the ones that grew loud and angry, even the ones about the hostile takeover attempt that had been building against her for the past 3 months. A rival executive named Damon Cole had been quietly buying shares of Voss Global through smaller investment groups, trying to gather enough votes on the board to force her out of the company her father had built. Elena fought him in boardrooms and behind closed doors, and Jack drove her from one battle to the next without ever asking what any of it meant. She noticed things about him she was not supposed to notice. He skipped lunch more often than not, though he always claimed he was not hungry. Once, arriving early for a 6 a.m. pickup, she found him asleep behind the wheel, with a child's drawing taped to the dashboard, a crayon picture of a stick-figure man standing beside a stick-figure girl under a yellow sun. She had not woken him right away. She had stood outside the car for almost a full minute, watching a man who clearly had nowhere warmer to sleep, and something in her chest had tightened in a way she did not examine too closely. Another time, a delivery truck backfired on the street beside them, a sharp, loud crack, like a small explosion, and Jack's whole body had gone rigid for half a second, his hand moving toward his hip out of some old instinct before he caught himself and returned to stillness. Elena had seen it in the rearview mirror. She had said nothing, but she had begun to wonder what kind of life left a man with reflexes like that. Once, waiting for her outside a restaurant where she was having a difficult dinner with 2 board members, he had left the car briefly and come back holding a small folded flag, the kind given to families at military funerals, tucked inside a plastic bag from a dry cleaner. He placed it carefully back in the glove compartment when he thought no one was watching. Elena, walking back early from a dinner that had ended in shouting, saw the entire thing through the window and pretended she had seen nothing at all. She wanted to ask him so many questions. Who gave you that flag? Why do you flinch at loud noises? Why does a man who drives so carefully know exactly how to control a spinning car on a hill with no brakes? But she held the questions back, the same way she held back most of her feelings, filing them away for a day when there might be time to ask. That day came sooner than she expected, in the form of a car with no brakes and a service technician who, when questioned later that afternoon, swore on his own life that he had inspected the vehicle himself only 2 days before and found the brake lines completely intact. Grant Okafor arrived within the hour, his face grim as he examined the underside of the car with a flashlight, tracing a line of clean, deliberate cuts along the brake fluid lines. Cuts, not wear. Someone had wanted the brakes to fail exactly when they did, on exactly that hill, with exactly that outcome in mind. This wasn't an accident, Grant said, straightening up and looking at Elena with the kind of expression she had not seen on his face before. Somebody did this on purpose. Elena felt the cold settle into her stomach, the particular cold that comes from realizing that someone, somewhere, wants you gone badly enough to plan it. She thought immediately of Damon Cole and the votes he needed and the company he wanted, and she thought of every angry phone call and every veiled threat disguised as a business negotiation over the past 3 months. She looked over at Jack, who stood a few feet away, quiet as always, watching the mechanic's hands move along the brake line with an attention that was not casual at all. He had noticed the cuts before Grant said a word. She could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way his eyes had already mapped the scene and moved past it to scan the parking structure around them, checking corners, checking the rooftop of the building across the street, checking everything a person checks when they have been trained to expect danger from every direction at once. "You already knew," she said quietly, stepping close enough that only he could hear her. Jack did not deny it. "I noticed something felt wrong about 10 seconds before the pedal went soft," he said. "I should have said something sooner. How did you know what to do? Most people would have panicked. Most people would have hit that wall." He looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time since she had hired him, something behind his eyes seemed to weigh whether to tell her the truth or keep hiding behind the plain and careful answers he had given for 11 days. In the end, he only said, "I've been in situations where panicking gets people killed. You learn to think instead." It was not an answer, it was the edge of an answer, a single loose thread pulled from a much larger story that he was clearly not ready to share. Elena wanted to pull on that thread until the whole thing came undone, but the parking structure was filling with security staff and police, and there was no time for the conversation she wanted to have. That night, alone in her penthouse with the lights turned low and a glass of wine she did not touch, Elena found herself thinking not about Damon Cole or the votes he needed or the company that was under threat, but about the quiet man who had saved her life with a calm she still could not explain. She thought about the folded flag in the glove compartment, the crayon drawing on the dashboard, the flinch at the sound of a backfiring truck. She did not know yet that Jack Merrow had once worn a very different uniform, that he had crawled through places most people would never survive, that he had lost men he loved more than his own life, and that the calm she found so unnerving was not the absence of fear but the mastery of it, built over years of training most people never see and hope never to need. She only knew that someone wanted her dead, that her driver had just saved her life without hesitation, and that the two facts, taken together, meant that the coming weeks were going to test both of them in ways neither one could yet imagine. Outside her window, the city glittered on, indifferent to the war that had just quietly begun. 3 days after the cut brake lines nearly killed her, Elena Voss sat in a boardroom on the 40th floor of Voss Global Tower, staring across a polished table at Damon Cole, and tried to read a lie in his face that she could not quite find. Damon was smooth in the way that made people trust him before they had any reason to. He wore a suit that cost more than most people's cars and spoke in a voice that never rose, never cracked, never gave anything away. He had spent 3 months quietly buying shares of Voss Global through smaller firms with names that meant nothing until you traced the ownership back far enough, and now he had enough votes lined up to force a special meeting of the board, a meeting where he intended to argue that Elena's father's company needed new leadership. His leadership. "I heard about your accident," Damon said, folding his hands on the table. "Terrible thing. Cars can be unpredictable." "It wasn't an accident," Elena said. "The brake lines were cut." Something flickered behind his eyes, so brief she almost missed it. Surprise, perhaps, or something closer to irritation, the look of a man who has just learned that a plan did not unfold the way he expected. "I'm glad you're safe," he said, and the words came out smooth and empty, the way condolences do when they are offered by someone who does not actually feel sorry. She left the meeting with no proof of anything, only a feeling in her stomach that told her Damon Cole knew more than he was saying, and that feeling followed her down to the car, where Jack was waiting with the door already open. "How did it go?" he asked, pulling into traffic. "Like talking to a wall that smiles," Elena said. "He knew about the brakes before I told him, or he pretended not to know a little too well." Jack's eyes flicked to the mirror, checking the cars behind them, a habit she had started to notice he performed automatically now, like breathing. "People who plan things carefully don't usually show their hand in a boardroom," he said. "If it was him, he'll come at you somewhere quieter." "You sound very sure of that." "I've spent time around people who plan operations," he said, and then, as though realizing he had said more than he meant to, he closed his mouth and focused on the road. Elena let the silence sit for a moment before she spoke again. "Operations," she repeated. "That's an interesting word for a driver to use." He did not answer, and she did not push, though the word settled into her mind and refused to leave. That evening, her security chief Grant Okafor requested a private meeting in her office, and what he told her sharpened the fear she had been carrying since the parking garage into something with teeth. Grant had pulled traffic camera footage from 3 streets near the office building, and on one grainy frame, taken from an angle 2 buildings over, he could make out a man in a maintenance uniform entering the parking structure roughly 40 minutes before Elena's car had started its descent down the service road. The same man appeared on a second camera nearly a mile away 2 hours later, getting into a car registered to a rental company that had been paid in cash. "We ran his face through what we could," Grant said, sliding a printed photograph across the desk. "Nothing came up in any public database. Either he's a nobody or somebody scrubbed his record clean. The man in the photograph was unremarkable in every visible way. The kind of face built to be forgotten, narrow jaw, short hair, eyes that gave nothing away. Elena studied it for a long moment before pushing it back across the desk. "Find out who he works for," she said. "And Grant, I want you to look into something else for me. Quietly." "What's that?" "Jack Merrow. My driver." Grant's eyebrows rose slightly. "You want me digging into the man who just saved your life?" "I want to understand the man who just saved my life," Elena said. "There's a difference. Something isn't adding up about him, and I don't like things that don't add up around me right now." Grant nodded and left without argument, and Elena sat alone in her office for a long time afterward, watching the city lights come on one building at a time, wondering what kind of man could stop a spinning car with no brakes as easily as most people stop a bicycle. The answer came 2 days later, though not in the way she expected. It was nearly midnight when Elena's phone rang with an unfamiliar number, and against her better judgment she answered it. The voice on the other end was calm, almost pleasant, with the particular flatness of someone reading from a script they had rehearsed many times. "You should resign from the board before the vote next month," the voice said. "It would be safer for everyone involved." "Who is this?" Elena said, already moving toward the window, scanning the street below, out of a habit she had never needed before this month. "Someone who would rather not repeat what happened in the parking garage," the voice said, and then the line went dead. She called Grant immediately, and within 20 minutes her penthouse was full of security staff checking every window and door, and within 30 minutes Jack Merrow arrived as well, though she had not called him, and though it was well past the hour his contract required him to be available. "Grant called me," he explained, before she could ask. "He thought you might want someone who knows how to check a building for entry points that aren't on the blueprints." She watched him move through her home with the same quiet focus he had shown in the spinning car, checking the lock on a side door that led to the service stairwell, checking the angle of the balcony from the building across the street, checking a utility closet that even her own security team had walked past without a second glance. It was not the behavior of a driver. It was the behavior of someone who had spent years thinking about how a space could be used against the person standing inside it. "You're not just a driver," she said finally, once the building had been cleared and the security staff had thinned out to a normal night rotation. "I need you to tell me what you actually are." Jack stood near the window, his reflection faint against the dark glass, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. Elena waited. She had learned, over the past 2 weeks, that pushing him only made him retreat further into silence, and that the only way to reach whatever he was hiding was to give him room to choose honesty on his own. "I was a driver in a warehouse before this," he said finally. "Before that, I did something else, something I don't talk about, not because it's a secret exactly, but because talking about it doesn't change what happened, and it only makes the people who ask feel like they need to treat me differently." "Try me," Elena said. He was quiet again, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something lower, something careful. "I served for almost 9 years. The last 4 were with a team that did work most people never hear about and wouldn't believe if they did. I'm not going to give you details, not because I don't trust you, but because some of it isn't mine to share. What I can tell you is that I left after a mission that didn't go the way it was supposed to go, and I haven't been the same kind of person since, and I promised my daughter I would never go back to that life." Elena thought of the folded flag in the glove compartment and did not ask about it, sensing that some doors needed to open on their own time. "Is that why you flinch at loud sounds?" she asked instead. "Is that why you knew exactly what to do when the brakes failed?" "Yes," he said simply, and the single word carried more weight than any longer explanation could have. She wanted to ask 100 more questions, but something in his face told her he had already given more than he was comfortable giving, and she respected that in a way she rarely respected anyone's limits, perhaps because she recognized the same instinct in herself, the same habit of keeping the heaviest things locked away behind careful, plain answers. "Thank you for telling me that much," she said instead, "and thank you for coming tonight, even though I didn't call you." "You're paying me to keep you safe," Jack said. That doesn't stop when the clock says it should. Over the following days, something between them shifted, though neither one named it directly. Elena found herself waiting for his arrival each morning with an attention she had not given her previous drivers, and Jack, in turn, began speaking more freely during the long stretches of traffic between meetings, telling her small things about his daughter Lily, about her love of dinosaurs and her stubborn refusal to eat anything green, about the apartment they had finally been able to afford again since his new salary started, small and modest but warm, with a working heater and a door that locked properly for the first time in over a year. Elena told him things too, quietly, the way people tell secrets to someone they have decided, almost without meaning to trust. She told him about her father, who had built the company from nothing and died before he saw how large it had grown, and about the loneliness of running an empire that everyone wanted a piece of and almost no one actually cared about, beyond what it could give them. The threats did not stop. Another call came, this one shorter and colder than the first, warning her that the board vote would go badly for her if she continued to resist. Grant's investigation into the man from the parking garage traced back through 3 shell companies before hitting a wall that looked deliberately built, professionally built, the kind of wall that only exists when someone with real resources wants to stay hidden. And through all of it, Jack stayed close, watching corners, checking mirrors, sleeping lightly in the small guest room off her penthouse security suite, on the nights when the threats felt closest, though he never said so directly, only appeared there each morning with dark circles under his eyes and coffee already brewing in her kitchen. One evening, as they drove home from a tense meeting with the board's legal counsel, Elena finally asked the question she had been circling for days. "What happened on that last mission?" she said quietly. "The one you said didn't go the way it was supposed to." Jack's hands tightened slightly on the wheel, and for a long moment the only sound in the car was the hum of the engine and the soft patter of rain that had begun to fall against the windshield. "I lost someone," he said finally, "someone who trusted me to make the right call, and I made the wrong one, and he didn't come home because of it." He did not elaborate, and Elena did not ask him to. She understood, in that moment, that some wounds are not meant to be explained, only carried, and that the kindest thing she could do was let him carry it in silence beside her, rather than dragging it out into words that would only make it heavier. They rode the rest of the way in a quiet that felt, for the first time since the brake lines had been cut, almost peaceful. The break-in happened on a night when Elena had given her staff the evening off, a small kindness she rarely allowed herself to indulge in, and the timing was not a coincidence. She was in her study reviewing shareholder documents when the lights in the hallway flickered once, then went dark, and the low electronic hum of the building's alarm system, always present in the background of her life, whether she noticed it or not, simply stopped. Silence has a different quality when it means something is wrong, and Elena felt that particular silence settle over her penthouse like a held breath. She reached for her phone and found no signal at all, not even the single bar that usually clung stubbornly to the edge of her screen. Someone had jammed it, and the realization sent a cold wave through her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Jack was not scheduled to be there that night. His shift had ended 3 hours earlier, and she had told him to go home to Lily, insisting she would be fine with the normal security rotation in place. She did not know yet that Grant Okafor had quietly asked Jack to stay nearby without telling her, uneasy about a pattern he had noticed in the surveillance logs, uneasy about 3 separate reports of an unfamiliar van parked on different streets near the building over the past week. The first sound came from the service stairwell, a metal door easing open with the careful quiet of someone who did not want to be heard, followed by the door easing shut again with the same deliberate control. Elena rose from her desk and moved toward the small safe room built into the corner of her study, a space few people even knew existed, installed by her father decades earlier during a different era of corporate threats. Her hand was on the door when a second sound reached her, closer this time, footsteps in the hallway just outside her study, moving with a confidence that told her whoever it was had studied the layout of her home before ever setting foot inside it. She had almost reached the safe room door when it swung open from the other side, and for one terrifying heartbeat, she believed she had been caught between two intruders, until she saw Jack's face in the dim light spilling from the hallway. "Move," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, pulling her inside and pressing the heavy door nearly shut behind them, leaving only a narrow gap through which he could still see into the study. "Grant called me 20 minutes ago. I came up the fire escape." "How did you know?" she whispered back, her heart still hammering. "I didn't, not for certain. I've learned not to wait until I'm certain." Through the narrow gap in the door, they watched two shapes move through the study, flashlight beams sweeping low across the floor, deliberately avoiding the windows where light might be seen from outside. The men moved with training, checking corners the way soldiers check corners, and Elena understood, watching the tension radiate off Jack's shoulders beside her, that these were not simple burglars looking for jewelry or cash. "They're not here to steal anything," Jack breathed. "Stay behind me. Whatever happens, stay behind me." One of the men paused near the desk, his flashlight settling on the papers Elena had been reviewing before the lights went out. Documents related to the board vote, related to the fight against Damon Cole's takeover attempt. He photographed several pages quickly with a small camera before moving on, confirming what Elena had already begun to suspect, that this break-in had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the war being fought over her company. The second man drifted toward the safe room door, and for a moment Elena's entire body went rigid with fear, certain they had been found, until he turned instead toward a bookshelf along the far wall, running his flashlight over the spines with a bored, methodical patience. Jack's hand found hers in the dark, not for comfort exactly, but as a signal, a silent instruction to stay perfectly still. She felt the calm radiating from him even as her own pulse hammered in her ears, and she understood, in that suspended moment, something about the years of training that had shaped him into a person capable of standing perfectly motionless in the dark, while danger walked past an arm's length away. The two men left as quietly as they had entered, taking nothing but photographs, and it was nearly 10 minutes before Jack finally opened the safe room door and allowed Elena to step back out into her own study, her legs unsteady beneath her. Grant arrived within the hour, along with two police detectives who documented the scene with grim efficiency, dusting for prints they both privately suspected would come back clean, given how carefully the intruders had planned everything else. Elena sat wrapped in a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, watching the careful choreography of professionals cleaning up after an intrusion that had never been about theft at all. "They photographed the board documents," she told Grant. "Nothing else was touched." "That confirms it," Grant said grimly. "Somebody wants to know exactly what you're planning before the vote. Somebody with enough resources to jam a building's communications and bypass a security system that cost more than most people's houses." Elena looked over at Jack, who stood near the window, still scanning the street below out of habit, his jaw tight in a way she had come to recognize as the shape his face took when he was holding something back. "You knew something was going to happen tonight," she said, "before Grant even called you." "I felt it," Jack admitted. "There's a feeling that comes before something goes wrong, if you've spent enough time waiting for things to go wrong. I can't explain it any better than that." Later that night, once the police had gone and Grant had doubled the security detail around her penthouse, Elena found Jack in her kitchen, making a pot of coffee neither of them particularly needed, his hands moving through the familiar motion, the way some people rely on ritual to steady themselves after fear. "I need to know more," she said, sitting down across from him. "Not because I don't trust you, because I think whoever is doing this isn't going to stop, and I need to understand what kind of help I actually have standing beside me." Jack poured 2 cups and set one in front of her before sitting down himself, and for the first time since she had hired him, he did not immediately retreat into careful, plain answers. "I joined the service at 18, he began. "My father worked the docks his whole life and never had $2 to rub together, and I wanted something that would give my life direction, something bigger than myself. I didn't expect to end up where I did. I was good at the physical parts, better at staying calm than most of the men around me, and eventually I was selected for advanced training that most people never even hear exists. He described it carefully, without naming units or operations, speaking in the general shapes of things rather than the specific details he had promised himself, years ago, never to share with anyone outside the small circle of men who had lived through it beside him. 9 years of service. Years of training so demanding that most candidates quit before completing it. Deployments to places whose names never appeared in any newspaper. A team of 6 men who became closer to him than his own blood, who knew things about him that even his ex-wife, Lily's mother, had never known. On the last mission, we were sent in to extract someone, he said, his voice growing quieter, flatter, the careful control of a man narrating something he had rehearsed, telling himself 1,000 times in the dark, alone, unable to sleep. The intelligence was wrong, not wrong by a little, wrong in a way that meant we walked into something we weren't prepared for. I made a call, in the moment, about which direction to move the team, and it turned out to be the wrong direction. Marcus didn't make it out. Elena sat very still, sensing that any word from her might close the door he had just opened, and let him continue at his own pace. He had a wife and a daughter waiting for him at home, same as me, Jack said. I carried some of his gear back myself, because I couldn't let anyone else do it. I gave the flag to his wife at the funeral, and she gave one back to me, because she said Marcus would have wanted his best friend to have something to remember him by. I've kept it in my glove compartment ever since. I don't know why. I guess it feels wrong to leave it anywhere else. That's not something you should carry alone, Elena said softly. I made my peace with carrying it, Jack said. What I couldn't make peace with was staying in that life afterward. I put in for discharge within a month. Lily was 2 years old, and I decided I would rather be a mediocre father who came home every single night than a good soldier who might not come home at all. He told her the rest more quickly, as though the hardest part had already been said and the remainder was simply logistics. The difficult years after his discharge, when the skills that made him exceptional in the field translated into almost nothing in civilian job listings. The marriage that had already been strained by his years of deployment, ending quietly and without much anger, because his ex-wife had grown tired of loving a man who was present in body but absent in every other way that mattered. The months of unemployment, the apartment they lost, the nights spent in his car with Lily asleep in the back seat under a blanket that never quite kept out the cold, the interview at Voss Global that he had walked into believing he had nothing left to offer anyone. I didn't tell you any of this because I needed the job, he said finally, and because people treat you differently once they know. Either they pity you or they're afraid of you, and I didn't want either one from you. I just wanted a normal job, driving a car, keeping my head down, taking care of my daughter. I don't pity you, Elena said, and I'm not afraid of you. I think you might be the only person in my life right now who I'm certain isn't trying to use me for something. Jack looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his careful expression, and Elena felt, not for the first time in the past weeks, a warmth in his presence that had nothing to do with gratitude for saving her life, and everything to do with the simple, rare comfort of being understood by someone who never demanded anything in return. The investigation into the break-in moved forward over the following days, though it yielded frustratingly little. Grant's contacts traced the jamming equipment used that night to a supplier with known ties to private security firms often hired by corporations for aggressive competitive intelligence work, the polite industry term for the kind of espionage that stayed just barely inside legal boundaries most of the time. One of the firms on that supplier's client list belonged, through 2 additional layers of ownership, to a holding company controlled by Damon Cole. It was not proof. It was a thread, thin and careful, the kind of thread a good lawyer could argue meant nothing at all. But it confirmed what Elena had suspected from the very beginning, and it hardened her resolve in a way that fear alone never could have. He's not going to stop until the vote, she told Jack and Grant during a tense strategy meeting 3 days later. And if he's willing to cut brake lines and break into my home, I don't think he's going to stop even then, not unless he gets exactly what he wants. There's a gala next week, Grant said. the industry benefit dinner. You're required to attend as the largest donor. It's a public event, hundreds of guests, dozens of entrances, and half the board members who'll be voting on the takeover will be there in person. That sounds like exactly the kind of place someone dangerous would want me to be, Elena said. It is, Jack said quietly, and something in the flat certainty of his voice sent a chill through the room. A crowd that size is chaos. Chaos is exactly what someone with the right training uses to their advantage. Then we cancel, Grant said immediately. Or we send your regrets, and let the board handle the optics. No, Elena said, surprising herself with the firmness in her own voice. If I cancel, it looks like weakness, and weakness right before a vote is exactly what Damon Cole wants the board to see. I'm going to that gala. Jack did not argue with her decision, though his jaw tightened in a way that told her he did not fully agree with it either. Instead, he spent the following days doing something Elena had not expected from a man who had promised his daughter he would never go back to that life. He requested the building blueprints for the gala venue. He walked the location twice, once during the day and once at night, noting entrances and exits and sight lines with the same careful attention he had once given to missions whose details he still refused to share. He spoke quietly with Grant about positioning, about coverage, about the specific vulnerabilities of a room full of important people who believed, wrongly, that money and status offered any real protection against a person determined to do harm. You don't have to do this, Elena told him the night before the gala, finding him still awake at nearly midnight, blueprints spread across her kitchen table. I know, Jack said, not looking up from the paper in front of him. I'm doing it anyway. Why? He was quiet for a long moment, his pen hovering over a marked exit near the loading dock of the gala hall. Because Marcus didn't get a second chance when the intelligence was wrong, he said finally, and I'm not going to let that happen again if there's anything I can do to stop it. Elena did not know, standing in her kitchen in the quiet hours before the most dangerous night either of them had yet faced, that the choice Jack made in that moment, the choice to step back toward a version of himself he had tried so hard to leave behind, was about to save her life in a way that would change both of their futures forever. The gala hall glittered with light from a dozen chandeliers, and Elena Voss moved through the crowd in a dark green gown, shaking hands, exchanging careful smiles, playing the role of a confident chief executive, while her mind stayed locked on the exits Jack had marked for her earlier that day, memorized without her even meaning to memorize them. Jack stood near the far wall, dressed in a plain black suit that let him blend into the staff, moving quietly along the edges of the room, close enough to reach her within seconds if something happened, far enough that no one would mistake him for anything other than part of the security detail Grant had assigned for the evening. His eyes moved constantly, sweeping the room in slow, deliberate passes, checking faces against the mental list he had built over the past week of anyone connected to Damon Cole, anyone who did not belong, anyone whose posture carried the particular tension of a person waiting for a signal. Damon Cole arrived fashionably late, moving through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands and laughing at jokes with the easy confidence of a man who believed the evening would end exactly the way he intended. He approached Elena near the champagne table, his smile as smooth and empty as it had been in the boardroom weeks earlier. "You look well, considering everything you've been through," he said. "Break-ins, car trouble, it must be exhausting, carrying so much weight alone." "I'm not alone," Elena said evenly. "And the vote is still 3 weeks away, Damon. I'd save the condolences until you actually have something to be sorry about." His smile did not falter, but something behind his eyes hardened, and he moved away without another word, disappearing into the crowd toward a side hallway that led, Elena knew from Jack's earlier walkthrough, toward the parking structure and the loading dock behind the building. Jack noticed the same thing from across the room, and something about the direction Damon Cole had taken, combined with a glance the man gave toward a service door that guests were never meant to use, sent a current of alertness through him that he had not felt this sharply since his last mission overseas. He moved toward Grant, who stood near the main entrance monitoring the room through an earpiece connected to the rest of the security team. Cole just went toward the loading dock hallway, Jack said quietly. That's not a guest area. I'll send someone to check it, Grant said. I'm going myself, Jack said, already moving. The hallway beyond the service door was dim, lit only by emergency lighting along the baseboards, and Jack moved through it with the silent, economical steps of a man who had spent years learning how to cross dangerous ground without announcing his presence. He heard voices ahead, low and urgent, and pressed himself against the wall near a support pillar to listen. She's supposed to be alone by 11, a man's voice said, tense and clipped. The event schedule has her doing a private donor meeting in the East Conference Room. That's when we move. And if the driver is with her, a second voice said. Then handle the driver, the first voice said. Quietly. We only need a few minutes with her before the car arrives to take her out through the back. Jack's blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sudden, absolute clarity of understanding exactly what was about to happen. This was not another warning call, another photograph of documents, another attempt to frighten Elena into resignation. This was an extraction. Someone intended to take her, tonight, quietly, through a door that guests were never meant to use. He backed away from the pillar as silently as he had approached, moving quickly now through the dim hallway back toward the main hall, his mind already working through the layout Grant had shared, the positions of the security team, the timing of the private donor meeting that Damon Cole had somehow known about before Jack himself had even confirmed it on the schedule. There's an extraction planned, Jack said, reaching Grant near the entrance, his voice low but urgent. 2 men, maybe more, waiting near the loading dock. They know about the private donor meeting scheduled for 11. They're going to take her through the back. Grant's face went pale. The donor meeting isn't public information. Only 3 people had that schedule. Me, you, and Cole's assistant, who requested it as part of the board coordination. Then Cole is the one who set this up, Jack said. We need to move her, now, before 11. But 11 o'clock was only 12 minutes away, and Elena, unaware of anything happening beyond the glittering crowd around her, was already being gently guided by a young assistant toward the East Conference Room for the private meeting that had been arranged, she believed, at Damon Cole's own polite request, framed as an olive branch ahead of the vote. Jack moved through the crowd faster than propriety allowed, ignoring the startled looks of guests he brushed past, his eyes fixed on the retreating shape of Elena's green gown disappearing through a doorway at the far end of the hall. Grant followed close behind, speaking urgently into his earpiece, redirecting the rest of the security detail toward the east wing. Jack reached the conference room doorway just as Elena stepped inside, and what he saw in the half-second before the door swung shut confirmed every fear from the hallway conversation he had overheard. 2 men in dark suits stood near the far wall, positioned casually enough to seem like waiting guests, but Jack had spent too many years reading the specific stillness of men preparing to act to be fooled by casual posture for even a moment. "Elena, wait," he called, pushing the door open before it could close, and the 2 men inside turned sharply, their hands moving toward jackets that concealed something Jack did not need to see clearly to identify. What happened next unfolded in seconds that felt, to Elena, both impossibly fast and strangely slow, the way time sometimes distorts itself around genuine danger. Jack crossed the room before the nearest man could fully clear his weapon, closing the distance with a speed that seemed impossible for someone who had spent the past weeks moving through her life so quietly, so carefully. He drove his shoulder into the man's chest, knocking him backward into a table, and in the same motion twisted the man's wrist until the weapon clattered uselessly to the floor, his own body angled to keep Elena shielded behind him the entire time. The second man lunged, and Jack met him not with force against force, but with the kind of precise, economical movement that came from years of training designed for exactly this purpose, a strike aimed not to punish but to disable, dropping the man to his knees before he could bring his own weapon to bear. Elena, pressed against the wall behind Jack, watched the entire sequence with a strange, detached clarity, aware even in her fear that she was witnessing something she was never meant to see, a part of Jack that had stayed hidden and dormant for years, called back into service in the span of a few desperate seconds. Grant burst through the doorway seconds later with 2 members of the security team, and within moments the 2 men were restrained, disarmed, and pressed to the floor. Their carefully planned extraction collapsed into chaos and failure. "Elena," Jack said, turning to her immediately, his hands moving over her shoulders and arms with quick, careful urgency, checking for injury, even as his own breathing remained remarkably steady. "Are you hurt? Look at me. Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she managed, her voice shaking despite the words. You knew this was going to happen." "I overheard them in the hallway," Jack said. "There wasn't time to explain. I just moved." The 2 men were taken into police custody within the hour, and though neither offered any information voluntarily, a phone recovered from one of them contained a series of messages that traced back, through an account registered under a false name, to a number that investigators would later connect directly to Damon Cole's personal assistant. Elena sat in a private room adjacent to the gala hall afterward, wrapped in a blanket for the second time in a month, her hands still trembling faintly as Grant coordinated with the arriving detectives. Jack sat across from her, his own composure finally beginning to crack now that the immediate danger had passed, his hands not quite steady as he accepted a glass of water from a member of the catering staff. "You could have been killed tonight," Elena said quietly. "Both of those men were armed." "So could you," Jack said. "That's the part that matters to me." "How did you know how to do that?" she asked, though she already understood most of the answer. "The way you moved. That wasn't luck, and it wasn't a job I'm paying you for." Jack set the glass down carefully, his eyes finding hers with an openness she had not seen from him before, not even during his quiet confession in her kitchen the week before. "I told you I served for 9 years, he said. "The last 4 were with a special operations unit. We trained for exactly this kind of situation. Close quarters, no time to think. Protect the person in front of you before anything else matters. I hoped I would never have to use any of it again. But I'm not sorry I did tonight." "You saved my life," Elena said. "Again. I promised my daughter I'd never go back to that life," Jack said quietly. "But I never promised her I'd stand by and watch someone hurt you. Those aren't the same promise." Elena reached across the small space between them and took his hand, not out of romance exactly, not yet, but out of a gratitude too large for words, a recognition of exactly what he had risked and exactly what he had given, first as a soldier for men who never came home, and now as a driver for a woman who had, until this month, been almost entirely alone in the fight for everything her father had built. "I need to know something," she said. "Was tonight enough for you, or is this only the beginning of what Damon Cole is willing to do?" Jack's expression darkened, and outside the private room, through the thin walls, they could both hear the low murmur of detectives discussing evidence, phone records, and the growing certainty that the man responsible for tonight's failed extraction was about to find himself facing consequences far beyond the loss of a boardroom vote. "I think," Jack said slowly, "that a man who has already tried twice and failed twice is either going to give up entirely or he's going to try something even more desperate before that vote happens. And I don't think Damon Cole strikes me as the kind of man who gives up." He was right, though neither of them yet knew how the final confrontation would unfold, or how completely it would change the shape of both of their lives once the dust finally settled. The days following the failed extraction moved quickly, though for Elena Voss they felt strangely slow, stretched thin by exhaustion and the particular kind of fear that lingers even after the immediate danger has passed. Grant Okafor worked with the detectives around the clock, building a case against Damon Cole from the fragments left behind, the phone records connecting his assistant to the 2 men arrested at the gala, the traced ownership of the security firm behind the break-in at Elena's penthouse, and eventually, after nearly a week of careful forensic work, a direct financial transfer from one of Cole's shell companies into an account belonging to the man who had cut the brake lines on Elena's car weeks earlier. It was not the kind of case that resolved itself in a single dramatic confrontation. It was slower than that, quieter than that, built through subpoenas and financial records and the patient unraveling of a plan that had once seemed untouchable. But it was solid, and it was enough. Within 10 days, Damon Cole was arrested at his own office, led out through the same lobby where he had once shaken hands with board members and smiled his smooth, empty smile, while stunned employees watched from behind glass partitions. The board vote, which he had spent months maneuvering to win, never happened at all. In its place came an emergency session where the remaining board members, shaken by the revelation of everything Cole had done, unanimously reaffirmed their support for Elena's leadership, several of them privately admitting they had suspected something was wrong for weeks, but had lacked the courage to say so aloud. Elena should have felt triumphant. Instead, sitting alone in her office after the emergency session ended, she felt only tired, the particular exhaustion that comes after months of fighting a war she had not chosen and could not have won without help she never expected to need. She found Jack waiting by the car when she came down that evening, standing exactly where he always stood, though everything about the moment felt different now, lighter somehow, as though a weight both of them had been carrying together had finally been set down. "It's over," she said, sliding into the back seat, then changing her mind halfway through the motion and climbing instead into the front passenger seat beside him, a small thing, but the first time she had ever chosen to sit there. "It's over," Jack agreed, watching her settle into the seat with a faint, surprised smile. "Cole's lawyers are already talking about a plea deal. Grant says the fraud charges alone will likely keep him occupied for years. I keep thinking about how close it came," Elena said quietly, watching the city lights slide past the windshield. "The breaks, the break-in, the gala. If you hadn't been there for any one of those moments, I don't think I'd be sitting here right now." "You would have found another way through," Jack said. "You're not someone who waits around to be rescued." "Maybe," she said, "but I didn't have to find another way, because you were there. I don't think I ever properly thanked you for that." "You gave my daughter a home with a working heater," Jack said. "You gave me a job that let me stop sleeping in my car. I think we're even, Elena." "I don't think we're even at all," she said, and something in her voice made him glance over at her, catching the small, uncertain smile on her face that he had never seen from her before, not once in the weeks he had known her. They did not talk about what was happening between them that night, though both of them felt it settling into place, quiet and undeniable, the particular understanding that grows between two people who have faced real danger together and come out the other side still standing, still choosing each other's company even when the danger has passed. Over the following weeks, life at Voss Global slowly returned to something resembling normal, though normal now looked different than it had before. Elena restructured the board, removing the members who had quietly supported Cole's ambitions and replacing them with people whose loyalty she trusted without question. She increased her security budget, not out of paranoia, but out of the hard-earned wisdom that came from nearly losing everything to a threat she had underestimated for too long. She also, quietly and without any public announcement, promoted Jack Merrow from driver to head of personal security, a position that came with a salary nearly triple what he had been earning before, along with responsibilities that finally matched the skills he had spent so many years trying to leave behind and had ultimately used to save her life not once, but 3 times over. Jack accepted the position with the same quiet, careful gratitude he brought to everything in his life, though it took him nearly a week of Elena's gentle insistence before he stopped trying to argue that he did not deserve such generosity. "You saved my life," Elena told him, standing in her office the day she made the offer official. "Multiple times. I'm not doing you a favor, Jack. I'm making sure I don't lose the person I trust most in this company." "I appreciate that," Jack said. "But I need you to know, I'm not doing any of this because I expect something in return." "I know," Elena said. "That's exactly why I trust you." The new position meant a new schedule, one that gave Jack more flexibility, more time, and for the first time in years, evenings that were entirely his own to spend however he chose. He chose, more often than not, to spend them with his daughter Lily, now 8 years old, still stubbornly refusing to eat anything green, still fiercely devoted to dinosaurs, and increasingly curious about the woman her father worked for, the one he mentioned more and more often at dinner without quite meaning to. Elena met Lily properly for the first time on a Saturday afternoon in early autumn, when Jack, hesitant and a little nervous in a way she found unexpectedly endearing, invited her to a small dinosaur-themed birthday party being held at a community center near their apartment. Elena arrived carrying a gift that Lily unwrapped with the particular explosive enthusiasm only an 8-year-old can summon, a detailed model kit of a Tyrannosaurus skeleton that took the two of them nearly the entire party to assemble together on the floor of the community center, laughing over misplaced pieces while Jack watched from a nearby table with an expression Elena had never seen on his face before, something unguarded and warm and entirely without the careful control he usually carried into every room. "She likes you," Jack said afterward, as they cleaned up the last of the paper plates and half-deflated balloons. "I like her too," Elena said. "She asks better questions than most of my board members." "She gets that from her mother," Jack said, and then, after a pause, added, "the curiosity, not the board meetings." Elena laughed, a real laugh, unguarded in a way she rarely allowed herself in front of anyone, and Jack found himself watching her with the same quiet attention he usually reserved for scanning rooms for danger, except now the attention had nothing to do with threat at all. Their relationship grew slowly after that, built not on the drama of shared danger, but on the quieter, steadier foundation of shared dinners, shared conversations about difficult days, shared silences that no longer felt like distance, but like comfort. Elena learned to cook simple things in Jack's small, warm kitchen, badly at first, then gradually less badly, while Lily supervised with the stern authority of a child who had strong opinions about how much cheese belonged on anything. Jack learned to sit through long board meetings as her security consultant without once looking bored, his attention sharp and useful in ways that made her decisions better, not just safer. 6 months after Damon Cole's arrest, his trial concluded with a conviction on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping, the judge noting in her sentencing remarks that the calculated nature of the crimes, targeting not just a business rival but a human life, warranted the maximum sentence available under the law. Elena did not attend the sentencing. She had, by then, largely stopped thinking about Damon Cole at all, her attention consumed instead by the far more interesting problem of building a life that included room for a driver turned security chief and his stubborn, dinosaur-loving daughter. On the 1-year anniversary of the day the brakes failed on that service road behind Voss Global Tower, Elena found herself once again in the passenger seat beside Jack, though the car was different now, and the circumstances entirely changed. They were driving to Lily's school for a spring performance, a small production about the water cycle that Lily had been rehearsing for weeks, with an intensity Elena found completely charming. "Do you ever think about how strange it is," Elena said, watching the familiar city streets pass by, "that the worst month of my life turned into this?" "I think about it every day," Jack said. "I almost didn't take the job, you know. I thought a man like me had nothing left to offer someone like you." "You had everything to offer," Elena said. "You just didn't know it yet." They arrived at the school with a few minutes to spare, finding seats near the front of the small auditorium among the other parents, and when Lily spotted them from backstage, peeking through the curtain in her handmade raindrop costume, her face broke into a grin so wide it seemed to light up the entire room. Jack waved back, his hand finding Elena's in the space between their seats, and Elena laced her fingers through his without hesitation, thinking, not for the first time, about the strange and winding path that had led a broke single father with a hidden past and a billionaire executive fighting for her father's legacy to this exact moment, sitting side by side in a school auditorium, waiting for a little girl in a raindrop costume to remind them both what it felt like to simply be happy. The performance began, Lily's small voice carrying clearly across the auditorium as she recited her lines about clouds and rain and rivers finding their way back to the sea, and Elena Voss, who had once run a company built entirely on control and careful distance, found herself crying quietly in a folding chair beside the man who had saved her life, grateful in a way she had never quite let herself be grateful before, for the small, ordinary miracle of a life rebuilt from wreckage, one careful day at a time. Outside the school windows, the afternoon light settled gold and warm across the parking lot, over Jack's car parked in its usual spot, over the folded flag still resting quietly in the glove compartment, a piece of the past he would always carry, beside the future he had never expected to find.